Missouri beats out the defending national champions for an explosive playmaker. Sounds good to me. Let's talk about Shaun Terry and more right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. And speaking of hoops, I think Dennis Gates' plan for the future is pretty obvious, but I do think there's one variable in particular that basically the entire thing hinges on. So I want to talk about that, of course. And let's start by reminding you that today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. And yes, if you listened to all of yesterday's program, I just talked about how this offseason, probably not a lot of Friday shows here in the next few weeks. Well, I didn't expect Shaun Terry to commit necessarily yesterday, kicking off what should be a big-time wide receiver weekend of visitors for Missouri. Three big names at receiver going to be visiting Missouri, but another, again, Shaun Terry, has committed to the Tigers. And if you're not excited, again, context is everything here. Obviously, we get more excited about five-star guys, four-star guys, all that good stuff, but landing three-star Shaun Terry out of Ironton, Ohio, again, who wanted him? Who was the take for right at this moment? Well, Michigan wanted him, no question. He was a former Notre Dame commitment. Very recently, Michigan, he had just taken an official visit to the Wolverines after backing out of his Notre Dame commitment. It wasn't very long off after that Nebraska made an offer to this young man as well. So what you're first going to notice is the size. At 5'11", 180 pounds, I think a lot of that may explain his relatively low ranking because while he's not a huge volume guy at all, at least last season in high school in Ironton's rather run-heavy spread offense, the guy is absolutely explosive. The statistics bear that out, but even more so on film. A guy who averaged nearly 20 yards a catch, also about 15 yards a rush as well. So not a massive amount of volume, but nearly 400 yards rushing with 5 touchdowns as well. A heck of a jet sweeper. Even they would line him up in the backfield on occasion, some direct snaps at quarterback as well. But when you watch his film, it's almost comical how much he's outrunning absolutely every single person on the field. Of course, with Ironton being a run-heavy offense, you're going to get those high school safeties to bite quite often. So there's a lot of one-on-one matchups downfield where Terry is just absolutely blazing by his man. So that's kind of tough to evaluate in some ways, to be honest with you. That's why I'm almost more excited about watching what he can do when he's got the ball close to the line of scrimmage, in a jet sweep, that type of thing. Also, as a punt returner, it's just very obvious that in small spaces, he's incredibly shifty. And the amount of times in his high school film that he would basically break 3 or 4 tackles, jump to the outside, and then run all the way across the field, quite literally, eventually scoring. I mean, honestly, I was starting to crack up as I was watching his film while eating my breakfast this morning. But again, a versatile guy that I would expect to play the slot for Missouri moving forward, though he's in much more of the sort of Luther Burden or Dominic Lovett slot mode, as more of an explosive player from that spot instead of maybe your sort of traditional possession receiver, maybe a guy like Tommy Saunders from the past, or more recently Barrett Bannister, somebody like that. I think this is much more of a guy in the Luther Burden mold, though obviously, again, Terry at 5'11", 180 does not have the type of physical stature that Burden does, but the explosiveness is very much there. I think Terry's a very interesting prospect. Again, obviously, if the defending champs wanted him, heck, I want him too. And now that projections for the season are starting and predictions are starting to trickle out a little bit for the coming football season. For example, Stuart Mandel over at The Athletic had Missouri as the first team out of the college football playoff. Some Missouri fans saw those rankings, saw, for example, Florida State as the 3 seed in the football playoff and Utah as the 4 seed. And we're saying, now, what the heck? How can you have those teams projected that highly? Not even just compared to Missouri, but compared to the rest of the country. Well, this is a good time for a reminder, ladies and gentlemen. The top 4 teams in the college football playoff will get a bye, and it's going to be almost certainly the top 4 conference champions. Yes, the top 4 ranked conference champions are guaranteed those byes. So you're talking an SEC champ, a Big Ten champ, and yes, also an ACC champ and a Big 12 champion as well. So it's possible. It's quite possible. I don't know that it's likely, but it's possible there could be a Big 12 champion out there that isn't ranked actually inside of the top 12. But regardless, one of those spots is going to a Big 12 champion. Also, a group of 5 team, a non-power 4 team. They're going to get a spot, the number 12 seed almost certainly as well. So all of these things factor in to a Missouri team that, hey, it is possible the Tigers could be on the outside looking in if they go 10-2, for example. But I think a lot of this, including Phil Steele's top 40, where he has Missouri 18th, that's obviously within the realm of possibility for Missouri to be the 18th team in the country. My argument with Phil Steele, if I would have one with him, would be, hey, I understand that Missouri has some question marks on defense, the corner position, defensive coordinator, for example. But if you're going to rank Iowa 11th, for example, see, this is something I've talked about quite a bit. To me, if you're going to have questions on one side of the ball, make it defense versus offense because, well, defense is just a lot more unpredictable from year to year. But if you have the kind of returning production offensively that Missouri has, that's a lot easier to count on than, frankly, an Iowa program that has had trouble scoring 1 or 2 offensive touchdowns consistently in ball games now for a couple years. So to me, to put Iowa ahead of Missouri, I just don't see it. Again, within the realm of possibility, yeah, sure. But as we sit here today, I just don't see how you can actually put your bets on Missouri versus on Iowa versus Missouri at this point. You're counting on a team that was frankly incompetent last year offensively. What has really changed for this coming fall? That would be my question. Now let's talk some hoops just quickly here to close out this segment. I do think looking at the Missouri roster, especially the movement this offseason with this freshman class, that Dennis Gates' plan for the future is pretty obvious. Much similar to what Leonard Hamilton did at Florida State. He wants length and switchable athletic defenders, especially on the wing and at the point of attack. Obviously, Missouri upgraded its size at the point guard position with Tony Perkins, the Iowa transfer this offseason, but also T.O. Barrett, for example, a true freshman who is probably 6'3", 6'4". He's your lead ball handler point guard in that freshman class. So obviously that's the plan here. And I think with Marcus Allen, with Honor Boating, guys like that, for example, in that freshman class, I think you've got the requisite length and athleticism out there on the wings. I think what this entire plan hinges on and just how successful it will ultimately be in the coming years, it's going to hinge on shooting, especially teaching shooting by Dennis and his staff, because I don't think athleticism playing defense really going to be too much of a problem for a lot of the guys on this roster. What we do need is for this staff to pull off more Kobe Brown and Shaun East three-point shooting and jump shooting in general type of transformations, because if they can do that, boy, watch out, because Boating and Allen, those type of players, they've got everything else, seemingly. If we can just teach them how to put the ball in the basket a little more, and again, with examples like Kobe and Shaun and Demoy Hodge, there are plenty of examples of it working in the last couple years. The more they can do it, well, I think that's gonna really show how good Missouri is here in the coming future. And coming up, I want to talk to Andrew Lyon of Locked On Gamecocks to talk about that South Carolina game. Are Missouri fans perhaps looking past this game a little bit? I think that could be a mistake. So I want to talk to Andrew here coming up in just a little bit. But first, let's talk about Gametime, because I'll tell you, during the summer, I absolutely love attending major league games, whether it's the Royals, the Cardinals, Wrigley Field, Yankee Stadium, whatever it might be. I'll just tell you this, Gametime, though, it's the best way to get Major League Baseball tickets. Makes them getting tickets far faster and easier. Prices on the app almost always go down the closer you get to the first pitch. And with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. And I just experienced this a month ago or so. Got absolutely fabulous tickets for a great price behind the Royals dugout and on deck circle. Had a great time, all thanks to Gametime. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed.
I am Locked On Gamecocks host Andrew Lyon. Please be joined by Locked On Mizzou host John Miller to talk about South Carolina's football matchup with Missouri Tigers that will be taking place later this fall, and giving fans sort of an idea of what to expect from both teams and maybe some things to look at with that matchup upcoming. John, how have you been doing this week?
Doing fantastic. I'm excited to talk some football with you, Brandon. I think we got an interesting matchup that maybe some Missouri fans are overlooking a little bit.
Yeah, no, and that last part, what you just said there, John, I think is a perfect segue into sort of the beginning of this show, which is going to talk about sort of the dynamic of this series. You know, for a good while when Missouri joined the SEC, John, it was a really good back and forth affair between both of these programs. And honestly, kind of one of the more underrated games in SEC play year in and year out. But I have to say at this point, that hasn't really been the case over the past 4 or 5 years. It's become more of a one-sided affair in favor of the Missouri Tigers. And last season, John, in all honesty, is the first time that I can recall where South Carolina fans coming into the game against Missouri, they really didn't expect to win this game. You know, the previous 3 or 4 years, and all fan bases are like this. You'll find some reason and or excuse, or maybe both in certain cases, why maybe you lost the game, why you maybe lost a couple games in a row. But once it gets to about 4 or 5 wins, and last year Missouri won by 22 points, the largest margin of victory in the series history up to this point, there's no denying it anymore. At this point, you've accepted it that Missouri is the better team right now between both these programs. So, John, how do Missouri fans view this game coming off of what all happened last season, both within the game, but also the entire season as a whole?
Well, it's interesting. You know, from my perspective, certainly Missouri on paper should be the favorite in this ball game. But, you know, traveling to Columbia, South Carolina, never an easy place to play. By the way, I'm going to be traveling to this game as well. That's going to be my road trip for this fall. So that should be a good time. Looking forward to checking the whole thing out.
Yeah.
But I think it's a real big mistake if Missouri fans are assuming a victory here. South Carolina is not the type of team you can just roll into, especially in their place, and expect a win. Now, what both of these teams will be looking like on November 16th is, of course, anybody's guess at this point. Again, I think Missouri should be favored, but at the same time, that's a real possible trap game. I really believe that.
Yeah, and you mentioned the possibility of this being a trap game. You know, you look at the schedule dynamic, and it does say that, you know, South Carolina, they may have an advantage in that regard. They play at Vanderbilt the week before, which I've mentioned before. That's almost the closest thing to a third bye week in this season as you can get here in the SEC. And then they play an FCS school in Wofford the week after this game against Missouri. Then for the Tigers, they play an intriguing game against Oklahoma at home the week before this game against South Carolina Definitely heard a lot of talk about, the back and forth between Missouri and Sooner fans on X, on all the types of social media this offseason. So I'm sure that's going to be an emotionally charged game. And then you got to play a tricky road game at Mississippi State, kind of same deal as South Carolina, more talented than them. But hey, Mississippi State, they're going to definitely play their butts off to try to defend their home turf as well. So when you take that into account, John, what are your overall thoughts on the schedule dynamic aspect of this game?
Well, I'll just say this. I agree with you. It could be worse, though, for Missouri. I think one thing that helps them out a lot there is you have back-to-back games in Tuscaloosa and then home against Oklahoma. Fortunately, Missouri does have a bye week sandwiched between those two games, so that comes at kind of the perfect time for the Tigers. The schedule really did fall nicely. Now, if you look at the projections for Missouri's schedule this year, they have the easiest schedule projected in the SEC, but that also makes it like 26th or 7th overall in the country. So I do think maybe a little bit more has been made of that than it should be so far.
Yeah. And, the other intriguing aspect about this game is sort of the changing narratives between both head coaches. You look at Shane Beamer and Eli Drinkwitz heading into the 2023 season, John, the narrative was kind of in reverse. Shane Beamer was the one that was getting a lot of flowers from people across the league and even nationally after how the Gamecocks ended the 2022 season. And Drinkwitz was a guy where we were sitting here asking, hey, if he has a bad season, if maybe they go 6-6 or maybe 5-7, does he even keep his job at this point? And then Drinkwitz turns around and has the best season by far of his young head coaching career to this point. So what are your thoughts on sort of the storyline surrounding that? Now this is sort of a game where, hey, Drinkwitz, he might not need this game quite as much as he needed the last couple years, whereas Shane Beamer, this might be a game he has to win just to make it back to the postseason in order to avoid missing out on a bowl game 2 years in a row.
No doubt, job security wise, I think now the dynamics have changed for Drinkwitz totally. He doesn't need the South Carolina game at all for job security purposes at this point. That he's secure. He's got an extension. He's making $9 million a year now at this point. He's going to be okay. But in terms of the college football playoff, Missouri, I think their goal is very clear. It's to make the 12-team playoff. I think they're going to have to go 10-2 to do it. It's kind of hard to see Missouri doing that if they lose to South Carolina. Not impossible, but that's where it is more of a must-win game. So if you think this is a game Missouri's looking past, I definitely wouldn't go that far. But to your point, Andrew, I've thought it's been very interesting. Going back all the way to last offseason, I was even kind of cautioning some of your listeners saying, hey, this is very much like year one Drinkwitz, all right? You over exceeded expectations a little bit. Now year two, well, same thing for Missouri. You had a bit of a step back. Now year three, people are going, oh, what do we have in this guy? Sort of like Dennis Gates, by the way, the basketball coach, to an even more extreme example, by the way. But I just think it's really interesting. What can South Carolina do here in year three? Year three for Missouri, they still had kind of that 6-6 type season, but you saw some steps forward. You saw things beyond just the box score and the final score of that game. So I guess what I'm telling South Carolina fans, I was kind of cautioning maybe a little bit to the optimistic side. Now I'm saying don't get too pessimistic. Give Beamer a chance. Even if this season is slightly below your expectations, look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, John, it is really funny how recency bias plays such a massive role in how we view all of these coaches and all these teams. Again, just this past offseason, South Carolina was a team that was getting a lot of attention, and now obviously they missed out on a bowl game. They definitely had a disappointing season. I think Shane Beamer would admit that himself if we had him on the show right now. But now it's kind of like Carolina's being overlooked. They brought in a top-notch transfer portal class, a top 20 high school class, new quarterback Lenore Sellers. Sure, he might not have quite the arm talent that Spencer Rattler has, but people think that he could be a really good quarterback down here. And just because of what happened last year, that's all kind of being brushed under the rug, so to speak. So obviously, a lot of time before this game takes place, and who knows, by that point, maybe things are a little bit different as far as the talking points regarding both of these teams in a positive way. But for Gamecock fans that are maybe interested about what the Tigers could look like heading into this season, some pieces come back, some really big ones, but also a couple of big losses at key spots. So how could the Tigers be trying to fill in maybe a couple of those voids that they have? John will tell us about all of that in a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks and Locked On Mizzou. All right, John, let's talk a little bit about what is going on up in Columbia, Missouri. As the Tigers, they bring back a big piece at the quarterback position in Brady Cook, a guy that showed a lot of improvement in 2023, threw for 578 more passing yards on 14 less attempts compared to 2022, along with 7 more touchdowns and 1 less interception. So a lot more efficient, a lot more big plays coming from Brady Cook's arm. It seems like that him recovering from that injury he suffered in 2022, I believe it was a shoulder injury, if I recall correctly, it helped him out a great deal. So with all that being said, John, what is the next step for Brady Cook as he prepares to head into his 3rd season as the starter up there in Missouri?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think maybe the improvements from 22 to 23 are maybe even more pronounced than what those total statistics would lead you to believe, quite honestly. But yeah, big time, the labrum surgery that he had. He played basically 10 and a half weeks of the season with an injured labrum in his right throwing shoulder. So that had a big effect on Brady. But, I think for him to take the next step this season, what I think Brady is good at already, I think he's good at distributing those short passes around the line of scrimmage. You see a lot of that in the Kirby Moore offense. Then you also see a lot of deep balls as well, a lot of deep shots down the field. And I think Brady really improved with deep ball accuracy, just off play action passes and that kind of stuff. He had some really nice slot fade patterns to Luther Burden for touchdowns in the Vanderbilt game. I'm just remembering off the top of my head here. I think for Brady to take the next step, it's maybe hitting more of those intermediate shots, those balls, 10 to 20 yards downfield. I think Missouri's tight end, Brett Norfleet, who was a true freshman last season, I think you saw him come on a little bit more as the season went along in the passing game. I think if you see more of that, Norfleet can play a big part, especially of opening up that intermediate middle part of the field for the Missouri offense. So to me, especially in the passing game, that's the next step.
Yeah, you mentioned those slot fade routes earlier that Brady Cook threw last season, and I got to say that was the thing that definitely stood out to me the most. I watched the LSU Missouri game while I was at the beach at that point in the season, and it was just impressive to me how he was spotting the football and
Yeah.
basically putting it right in the breadbasket. So Brady Cook definitely a big part of that offense last year. And another person that was a big part of that offense was running back Cody Schrader. I think he was the leading rusher in the SEC. Certainly came onto the scene. Not a lot of people, I think, expected him, maybe even some Missouri fans, to have the season that he had this past fall. You lose him, he goes on to the NFL. And I know, John, if there's one position that the Tigers have been really good at sort of replenishing the last few years, it has been running back, to be fair. But obviously, with everything Cody Schrader did, maybe even setting up the passing game a little bit because of how great he was in that zone run game, what are the Tigers looking to do to try to maybe fill in that void at that running back spot?
Well, Eli Drinkwitz loves to just use one running back for the most part, and he loves experience at most positions, but especially at the quarterback and the running back position. So what did Missouri do? They went into the transfer portal, added a couple guys with a lot of experience. Marcus Carroll, a 4-year player at Georgia State. They also got Nate Noel, who was somewhat coincidentally from Drinkwitz's old stomping grounds of App State. I think Carroll is sort of a little bit different of a runner than Missouri has had in recent years, at least a little bit different of a scheme style. He was more of a sort of straight vertical type runner, just straight ahead, at least in the scheme that he was running. What do they see in him? We'll see. They think he can probably translate to Missouri's outside zone heavy scheme that Schrader was so good at. I think Nate Noel in particular, his scheme was more similar to what Missouri ran last season. So I think what you're going to see, more than likely one of those two guys is probably going to take the lion's share of the carries and snaps in general at running back, because even on third downs, Missouri generally likes to just have one guy in there for, say, 85-90% of the important snaps. But like you say, Andrew, Missouri under Drinkwitz has done a nice job of manufacturing a running game, no matter if it's Tyler Beatty or Cody Schrader or Larry Roundtree. So I'm fairly confident that Missouri is going to be okay at the running back spot.
Yeah, and Marcus Carroll was actually one of those portal running backs where if South Carolina had not gone after and landed Raheem Rocket Sanders out of Arkansas, he was another guy that Gamecock fans were kind of hoping that they would pursue. So I think it's fair to say that at the very least with Carroll, I think y'all definitely landed a really good portal running back there. And at least one of those two guys, like you mentioned, will probably step up to the plate for the Tigers this fall. And then one other person I want to talk about, not a player, but on the coaching side, is defensive coordinator Blake Baker. I know that Missouri basically did everything within their power to try to hold on to him, but LSU came calling this offseason. I believe maybe his wife actually went to school down there
That's right.
in the state of Louisiana. And so the family pull was just probably a bit too much to overcome there with Blake Baker. He heads on to Baton Rouge. And obviously, he's been a big piece of the success the Tigers have had the past couple of years, John. So what are things looking like on the defensive side of the ball heading into a year where the Tigers are looking to capitalize on the momentum that they built up last year?
Well, as we were just talking about running back on the offensive side of the ball, really that's about my only question mark because the quarterback's back, the pass receivers are back. Missouri did, I think, a nice job of plugging the two holes that they needed to replace at offensive line. Defense is a whole completely different story. A really good Missouri defense the past couple seasons. Blake Baker deserves a lot of credit for that, for sure. And Missouri obviously wanted Baker back. They offered him a very strong offer of maybe possibly a little bit over $2 million a year. Ultimately, LSU gets it done with $2.5 million. And again, probably the ties to LSU. A somewhat surprising move to me. We don't have to get into that. The point is, again, new defensive coordinator. The two cornerbacks both were drafted into the NFL. Darius Robinson, a first-round pick as an edge rusher. Those are some really big pieces for Missouri to replace. I think they like some of the guys they brought in the portal for sure. But you know what? You do have to be somewhat skeptical about the Missouri defense until you see it. Corey Batoon, the new defensive coordinator. How's it going to all work? All I've seen is the spring game where you couldn't even tackle so far. So I'm not going to make a lot of judgments there. To me, it's just an unknown. I'm not saying I'm confident or skeptical, really. I'm just saying it's an unknown.
Yeah, and that's absolutely more than fair. And, it might be a good time for Missouri to have maybe one of the quote unquote easier schedules in the SEC because of the fact that, there are maybe some skepticism or there's some question marks to be had on one side of the ball that has been so pivotal for the Tigers over the past couple of years.
And that'll do it for this edition of Locked On Mizzou. I've got now South Carolina, Auburn checked off. How about some Oklahoma, Alabama, Texas A&M, those kind of crossovers, the important Missouri opponents. Let's do it here this offseason. So until then and until next time, I am John Miller. Thanks as always for listening to Locked on Mizzou.